Innocent IV declared that torture was kosher, both for interrogation and punishment, as it was used to great effect during the Inquisition. But all trends are cyclical, and so by the 18th century, torture once again fell out of fashion in European courts, which were starting to prefer evidence over forced confessions. This time, the pendulum took about 200 years to swing back, but sure enough, as World War I ended, strong men and leaders rose to power across Europe, each bringing with them a secret police force who were all too happy to get their hands dirty, enforcing their respective authoritarian regime by applying new methods to this very old profession. It took a bit longer for this to be felt stateside. In 1948, the U.S. helped pass the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but in a move that might feel pretty familiar, the conservatives jumped on this issue, arguing that it represented a Luciferian globalist one-world government NWO takeover. I'm sure it was also just a coincidence that Jim Crow was a clear violation. In response, conservatives tried to pass the BRICR Amendment, which would limit the president's control over foreign policy. Eisenhower stopped this, but to do so, he had to prove that he wasn't a little bitch by refusing to sign the UN Covenant on Human Rights, the UN Covenant on the Political Rights of Women, or support the genocide. Now, we already covered how the CIA's fear of communist brainwashing was the catalyst for Operation Bluebird, but I left a couple details out. While Bluebird was absolutely trying to develop all sorts of weird mind control techniques through drugs and hypnosis, the image that calls to mind is probably some guys in white lab coats waving a pocket watch back. In reality, what Bluebird actually entailed was a lot closer to, Bluebird's first ever memo called for experiments, quote, investigating the possibility of control of an individual by application of special interrogation techniques, using defectors, refugees, POWs, and others. While this was started by Hillenkoetter in 1950, it really took off after Allen Dulles joined the CIA. In order to try out these special interrogation techniques, they needed somewhere nice and remote. One of the first of such places was a captured Nazi base in Germany on the outskirts of Ubersoll called Camp King, where a notoriously brutal group of American soldiers called the Rough Boys conducted interrogations. The CIA began performing Bluebird experiments just outside the base's perimeter in a safe house, i.e., a secret prison they built where captured enemy agents could be subjected to experimental torture methods. The modern term for this is, of course, a blast. The agents who conducted these Bluebird interrogations were working under the skilled eye of a doctor who they referred to as Doc Fisher. His real name, though, was Walter Schreiber, the former Surgeon General of the Nazi Army, who approved all manner of horrific experiments on the inmates of Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Dachau. After the war, Schreiber was captured by the Russians and imprisoned in the infamous Lubyanka prison, but managed to escape and sneak over to West Germany, where he turned himself over to the Counterintelligence Bureau, who quickly scooped him up in Operation Paperclip, then sent him to Camp King. There, the tables were turned, and Schreiber was set to work plying his trade on captured soldiers. This wound up being such a hit that soon similar black sites started opening up shop all over West Germany and then East Asia, often coming complete with their own war criminal doctors provided by Operation Paperclip. One example was Shiro Ishii, who ran Japan's infamous Unit 731, a German warfare research division stationed in Manchuria, who served as the inspiration for the chemical. Unit 731's research involved dissecting the bodies of between 3,000 and 12,000 prisoners while they were still alive. But directly following the war, the bourgeoisie Tokyo war crimes trial was trying to take punitive measures, but the U.S. stepped in to mediate a transformative justice process based on anarchist principles of abolition, in which Ishii was allowed to avoid all charges in exchange for turning over his research and taking a job at an East Asian black site, shooting up captured North Koreans with benzodrine and sodium amine. Remember, kids, ACAB includes war crime tribunals. It's my best bread tube impression. Anyways, as we know, Sidney Gottlieb was brought into the agency in 1951, and shortly thereafter, Bluebird was renamed to Artichoke and handed over to him. As one of Dulles' early memos makes clear, while Artichoke had a much wider scope than Bluebird, at its core, it would be a continuation. Our principal goal remains the same as it was in the beginning: the investigation of drug effects on ego control and volitional activities, i.e., can willfully suppress information be elicited through drugs affecting higher nervous systems? If so, which agents are better for this purpose? Team Artichoke began conducting their experiments at a black site in the Panama Canal called Fort Blake. Their first guest was a prisoner they called Keller, real name Dmitry Dimitrov, a Bulgarian politician who'd been sharing intel with the CIA. The issue, though, was that they heard Dimitrov might have been thinking of switching over to work with the French. Never once to take rejection. Well, the CIA did the only rational thing: kidnapping Dimitrov and bringing him to a Greek prison where they tortured him for 6 months. After that, he really didn't want to work with America, so they brought him to Fort Blake, where he was subjected to experimental torture methods for 3 years. In that time, while Dimitrov never really came around on Uncle Sam, a lot of other things did change. Under Gottlieb, Artichoke carried on conducting experiments primarily on Americans, and had seen some preliminary success with a combination of LSD, sodium pentothal, and hypnosis. The CIA guys were very excited about all of this, and so in '53, Artichoke was expanded again, turning into MK Ultra. Dulles announced the creation of what would be the CIA's most closely guarded secret in an oddly public way. On April 10th, exactly 3 days before the official launch of MK Ultra, Dulles gave a speech at a conference for his fellow Princeton alumni. The subject was the dangers of communist brainwashing, which he claimed were a dire threat to America, saying that the Soviets had mysterious techniques, the victims of which, quote, are deprived of the ability to state their own thoughts. Parrot-like, the individual so conditioned can merely repeat thoughts which have been implanted in their minds by suggestion from outside. In effect, the brain under these circumstances becomes a phonograph, playing a disc put on its spindle by an outside genius over which it has no control. Interestingly, though, as the speech went on, the methods Dulles described seemed to have a suspicious similarity to the types of things the CIA had been developing at black sites for the past 2 years. Claiming to have spoken to a Christian missionary who was tortured in China, Dulles said this man described how he had been subjected for 75 days to the monotony of interrogation, mostly during the night hours, by relays of brutal questions, deprived of sleep and subjected to the effects of bright lighting during the period of his questioning. As far as he knew, no drugs were used, but of course, they might have been used without his knowing. What makes this all the stranger is that, while with hindsight it's pretty clear that these rumors of communist brainwashing experiments were almost entirely bullshit, Dulles actually knew that back then too. Jumping back, on May 30th, 1951, Sir Henry T. Tizard, the senior scientist for the British Ministry of Defense, checked into the Ritz-Carlton Hotel at 1228 Rue Sherbrooke West in Montreal. He was there to address the Canadian Association of Physicists at a conference that would be taking place in 2 days. On June 1st, the day of the conference, Tizard gave 2 speeches, one over lunch and a second at dinner. In between these 2 addresses, he slipped away to the real reason for his trip. A meeting which he described in his diary simply as, quote, discussion with Solon, etc. Solon referred to Dr. Ormond Solon, the first chairman of the Canadian Defense Research Board. Etc. referred to Cyril Hastings, a senior researcher at the CIA, as well as a group of Canadian scientists and psychologists. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss, what else, the possible threat of communist mind. During the meeting, Tizard made it clear that, quote, there has been nothing new in the interrogation business since the days of the Inquisition. Shout out, pro innocent. He went on to say that there was no evidence of the Soviets making any changes to the state of torture. Rather, their techniques were, quote, remarkably similar to the age-old methods. But the meeting didn't end there. With that worry out of the way, they began toying with the possibility of the US, England, and Canada going on the offensive. The communists might not have been able to revolutionize the interrogation business, but maybe they could. The first major development in this process would ultimately come from another attendee of this meeting, a Canadian psychologist named Donald O. Hebb. Both the chair of the Human Relations and Research Committee of the Canadian Defense Research Board, as well as the head of the psychology department of McGill University, shortly after the meeting, Hebb took a defense grant for $10,000 and began conducting a series of experiments over the next 3 years that would completely change the practice of torture. In classic psychology fashion, Hebb's experiments were conducted on first-year students, all of which involved disrupting their senses. This started with what Hebb called experimental deafness, in which 5 test subjects had their ears plugged with cotton and petroleum jelly during the 3-day weekend. But things escalated quickly. Eventually, Hebb's students were being made to spend days in his black room, a small soundproof room with the white noise machines that block out all sound, opaque goggles over their eyes to block their vision, and foam tubes placed over their hands and around their heads to minimize tactile stimulus. The results were devastating. Test subjects showed dramatically reduced cognitive abilities after only a few hours. While most of them quit on the first day, those that stuck around past day 2 began hallucinating. They conducted another experiment to see how this treatment would affect the subject's susceptibility to propaganda by selecting subjects who were atheists and then, rather than white noise, played a loop recording of a man saying that science can't be trusted or that ghosts are real. Sure enough, the subjects reported a newfound interest in religion and the supernatural, which lasted for weeks after the experiment ended. Checkmate, for instance. Hebb's work, which on all official documents he claimed was meant to prevent railroad and highway accidents, had shown that the human brain needs sensory stimulus to function properly, and that the simple act of depriving someone of that constituted one of the most powerful forms of torture imaginable. In 1954, he presented his work at a conference for the American Psychological Association, which, interestingly, was held at the exact same hotel that Frank Olson had fell or jumped out of 1 year earlier. And just like the last time that hotel came up, there were a number of CIA agents in the building, this time on the lookout for promising research that could help MK Ultra. At this point, the agency was well aware of what Hebb had been cooking up. Not only had they played a role in funding him, but they even sent an undercover agent to secretly act as one of his research assistants. That said, at the convention, Hebb did not disappoint. His work earned him a lot of love from the CIA and even resulted in a Nobel Prize nomination. But in classic Canadian fashion, the same couldn't be said in Ottawa. The same year as the conference, the Canadian government decided that Hebb's research was a waste of money and cut the funding, canceling his work. What's more, he claimed that all of his raw research data were suddenly snatched up by some organization in the States. Bummer. Interestingly, the mysterious disappearance of those documents didn't seem to be too big of an issue for the CIA, who immediately began working to continue Hebb's work. They saw particularly promising results from an experiment in which a soldier suffered a complete breakdown after being kept in isolation for 40 hours. This got the attention of the former head of Artichoke, Morris Allen, as well as the guy who'd gone undercover as one of Hebb's research assistants, a brain surgeon from the National Institute of Mental Health named Maitland Baldwin. Allen and Baldwin got really excited and began advocating for the experiment to be repeated under terminal conditions, i.e. in a life or death circumstance. Now, this problem of a lack of terminal test cases actually came up 4 years earlier in Dulles' speech. was so much time spent describing the brainwashing methods that the communists were using, Dulles included a line that assured the audience that the US wasn't doing anything like this. Except he decided to do this in a pretty strange way by lamenting the fact that, unfortunately, America is just too dang moral.